Thank you very much, Madam Vice Chancellor, fellow faculty members, graduates, parents, and guests. It's a tremendous honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce Joe Schlesinger, and it's a challenge for me to do it in only about 3 minutes. In that time, I certainly won't be able to cram in as much as he did in each of the thousands of stories that he did for CBC television over more than 40 years. In fact, most of the time he had less than 3 minutes, but he was able to use each second of that in script and pictures masterfully and memorably. For Canadians who grew up in the second half of the 20th century, Joe Schlesinger was often the face and voice that took them to events outside Canada every night. The wars, the crises, the activities of world leaders, and much more. The day-to-day lives of people in countries and continents far away from Canada. For that generation, my generation, he's Canada's best known and simply Canada's best foreign correspondent. Starting in print at the Associated Press in his home of Czechoslovakia in 1948, Joe fled that year to Canada when the communist regime started arresting journalists. At the Vancouver Province and the Toronto Star, then back to Europe for United Press International in London and the Herald Tribune in Paris. He finally found his journalistic home in 1966 at the CBC. In 1970, he became the public broadcaster's Far Eastern correspondent, based in Hong Kong, and followed that with postings in Paris, Washington, and Berlin, seeing and telling Canadians about the war in Vietnam, conflicts between Pakistan and India, in Nicaragua, El Salvador, the Middle East, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, the fall of the Shah of Iran, virtually every major international event in the last half of the last century. He covered the travels of Richard Nixon, Pierre Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, Jean Chrétien, and Ronald Reagan's famous summits with Mikhail Gorbachev that changed our world. Most important, he was in Prague for Václav Havel's Velvet Revolution in 1989 that overthrew the communist rulers of his homeland, the country he'd first left in 1939 when his parents sent an 11-year-old boy to the safety of England to avoid the Nazis, never to see him again. They perished in the Holocaust. I was lucky enough to become parliamentary bureau chief for CBC TV News in 1993, when Joe was in Ottawa as the network's chief political correspondent. And that gave me an opportunity to watch and marvel at how Joe does his work. As an interviewer, he listens better than almost anyone I'd ever worked with. He observes just as closely and has a wonderful eye for the fine detail that is so telling. He knows that great television, which is what he always produced, shows viewers the story in pictures. It doesn't tell it to them in script. Joe's masterful at using listening and observation to find that revealing moment, the phrase or body language that told the real story, regardless of the words coming out of the person's mouth. Once he finds it, whether in doing a news story or the longer form documentaries he's done over the past decade or so, after he supposedly retired from CBC News in 1994, he builds his script around it, letting the viewer in bit by bit on what's about to unfold on the screen in front of them, using his extraordinary skills as a writer and storyteller. You may have noticed my description of how Joe works is in the present tense, not the past. Last May, I was walking through Trafalgar Square in London and saw someone doing a stand-up in front of a camera. I moved a little closer and said to myself, that sure looks like Joe, but it can't be him. So I moved a little closer, and only when I saw the Order of Canada pin on his lapel was I sure that it was him. We chatted for a couple of minutes. Then he went back to work, working on a Czech documentary, still filled with all the enthusiasm he's always had whenever he found a good story to share with his audience. For the last 40 years, we in Canada have been extraordinarily privileged to have been that audience, to have had the world brought to our homes and explained to us by someone who's witnessed so much, yet retained such a passion for passing it on to those around him, what he's learned to help us understand a complex world. Madame Vice Chancellor, in recognition of his inspiring reporting, his stellar career as a journalist, his international expertise and understanding, I request that you confer the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa upon Joe Schlesinger.
Thank you. I think you all agree with me. By virtue of the authority vested in me by the board and by the faculty senate, I hereby confer upon you the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa and all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto pertaining. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My trustee Kane and I thank you. I should say, Chris, you went over your time.
Well, Joe, you used to every once in a while too, and you got away with it, so I figured I would as well.
So now I have to get organized. You know, it's really great being here. Madam President and Vice Chancellor, Chair of the Board of Governors, Professor Odell, distinguished members of the university, students, parents, and guests. I want to thank the university for bestowing this honor on me. And I want to congratulate my fellow degree recipients, whatever variation of sheepskin you're getting today, for the long, hard work that brought you here today. For me, being here is a homecoming, a wonderful way of returning to a city in which I spent 3 happy years in the early 90s. It was my return from abroad from 30 years of being overseas. I'll tell you something, if any of you are going to be foreign correspondents, you better remember, one of these days you'll want to come back home. And it's difficult to come back home because you come back to the organization for which you worked all these years and they say, where have you been all these years? You know, what are you doing here now? But it is also a homecoming for me in a different way. There's another reason that makes me feel at home here. Right here, in this hall, looking at all the fields you graduates have studied, I feel a kinship with you. Public affairs, journalism, international affairs, those are things, after all, that I've spent my life at. Not, I should add, in the systematic and intellectually rigorous fashion you have. My schooling was more turbulent, haphazard, and personal. I grew up as a witness and victim of the greatest barbarities of the 20th century. Having survived the depredations of both Hitler and Stalin, where so many tens of millions of them, as you heard, my parents included, perished, I felt drawn to continue bearing witness to what Salman Rushdie called the terrible, unquiet fuss of history, and eventually drifted into pursuing it as a career. I became a journalist not because I couldn't leave the news alone. I became a journalist because the news wouldn't leave me alone. I learned a lot over the years, simply by osmosis, by traveling the world and observing the universe unfolding, much of the time, unfortunately, as it should. What I've arrived at is a Weltanschauung, a worldview that was formed by my experiences of witnessing the world constantly lurching between triumph and tragedy. This worldview of mine, I'll admit, lacks consistency. It's more a muddle of skepticism and idealism and bouts of cynicism and going in between there, and from one, depending on what we're dealing with. But let me start by looking at the good news. The wave of democratization that has swept the world since the whimpering fall of communism 2 decades ago. That's offset, of course, wouldn't you know it, by the bad news, that so many of these new democracies are democratic in name only. And we in the old democracies of the West feel disappointed that so many of those who we've helped get rid of authoritarianism, sometimes even by going to war, have let us down. But we shouldn't be surprised. What's wrong is our widespread expectation that you can just open the tight taps of authoritarianism and the pure water of democracy will come gushing out overnight. For many, all it takes to turn a country into democracy is to hold free elections. But elections are to democracy only what weddings are to marriage, a start. The tough part comes after the honeymoon. Democracies, like people, need time, often a long time, to grow up. Just consider how long it took the British to adapt to democracy from the Magna Carta 800 years ago through the tribulation of the Civil War of the Puritan Revolution in the 17th century. Or for that matter, the on and off flow of French democracy from revolution to reign of terror to monarchies, 3 empires, 5 republics in the space of less than 2 centuries. To say nothing of how long it took, for instance, Western democracies to give women the vote. Sure, everyone loves democracy, the freedom of it all. But what they really love is freedom for themselves and not necessarily for others. One man's liberty usually impinges on the freedom of another. Real democracy demands tolerance for those you don't agree with, even if they're a minority. It also requires the acceptance of compromise as an indispensable tool of governance. Furthermore, there is no such thing as one size fits all. Different societies have different needs and different traditions. Certainly, the idea that Western liberal democracy will triumph the world over is too simplistic. Even Western democracies have different patterns to fit their national temper. All you have to take is, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the United States and our sort of peace, order, and good government. And these differences can also be found in societies that don't have a choice about how they're governed. As much as communism was touted by Marx and others as a universal scientific form of governance, in practice, it differed from nation to nation depending on the character of its history. Soviet communism was certainly different from the Chinese Maoist version. Today, the communism of Vietnam and North Korea are light years apart. Countries can also go through various forms of governance and yet maintain a certain historic consistency through them all. Nations, I would argue, all have their own DNA. Buried deep in China's chromosomes is Confucianism. You can see today in the rise in China of the Confucian meritocratic system of governance. China's leaders may call themselves communists, but they're certainly not ideologues. They are, first and foremost, managers, and with their sober suits and ties, they dress like them. They represent a return to the mandarins of old who were chosen for their competence by an imperial examination system. And these days, if you go back to China, at the universities where I remember I was during the Maoist period and the only textbook was a little red book of Chairman Mao's thoughts, these universities are now increasingly elite institutions, and the fight for admission to these schools is fierce. Russia is another example. From the Russia of the Tsars, through the Soviet regime, to its current democracy, the rulers of the Kremlin have consistently relied on the same sinister arm of government to wield power, and that is the secret police. Under the Tsars, it was called the Okhrana. Now it's the FSB, the Federal Security Service. Under the Soviets, it was the Cheka, Okpu, the KGB, and now the FSB is headed by no other than ex-KGB agent Vladimir Putin and his cabal of fellow KGB officers. The world is driven by these collective memories. memories of triumphs and tragedies, of humiliation and heroism. The memories of Muslims of a time of greatness when they conquered much of the world and kept the flames of knowledge and tolerance alive while most of Europe was still mired in the Dark Ages. The memory of Jews, of their expulsion from the Holy Land, led to their return to millennia later to retrieve it. The memories of Irish Catholics still trying to deal in Ulster with the fallout of their defeat at the Battle of the Boyne 300 years ago. For that matter, the memory of French Canadians of their defeat 60 years later at the Plains of Abraham. These memories can, and often do, bring out the best in us. Unfortunately, they also fuel resentments and divisiveness that lead to some of the most vicious and intractable conflicts of our time. I know, what I've outlined so far makes for a bleak picture. Yet I have to tell you that for all that, at heart, I'm an optimist. Looking back at the world I grew up in, what we have today gives me great hope. The Europe of my childhood went through 2 world wars with more than 60 million dead and cruel dictatorships. Now Europe is at peace and mostly democratic. The Great Depression created miseries not only there, but here in North America too. Now, despite our current economic problems, both are by comparison tremendously prosperous. In Asia, tens of millions regularly starve to death in countries like India and China. Now these countries are growing in strength, confidence, and prosperity. In Latin America, almost all of it used to be run by military dictators. Now the colonels are just about all gone back to the barracks, and democracy is increasing its hold there. Much of Africa, it has to be admitted, particularly Black Africa, is still mired in misery. But at least Africans are increasingly in charge of their own destiny, and there are stirrings of progress that indicate that with time, they too will achieve better governance. Am I being Pollyannish? I don't think so. You name it, whether it's the improvement in the status of women, the lowering of racial barriers, increased life expectancy, lower infant mortality, wider access to education, better health care, or the growing self-determination of nations, most of humanity is in better shape than it was when I was young. For all our serious problems, we do live in an age of progress and of once undreamt of possibilities. But with everything moving so much faster than it used to, with the means of destruction, whether from wars or environmental degradation, acquiring such cataclysmic force, we have to act quickly and decisively to save humanity from its hubris. Only one thing is certain: we are fated to live in interesting times. Consigning someone to live in interesting times has for centuries been a curse, but it need not be. If we learn from history, if we use the modern tools of technology and muster mankind's common will, we could turn it into a blessing. So stay tuned and keep your eyes and your ears, and above all, your brains open. Thank you.